Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to, first of all, start off by thanking everybody for joining the session on liquidity and asset management. In this session, we're going to introduce you to some best practice fundamentals around this often overlooked aspect of financial management. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Florence Ledka, and I am the Chief Financial Officer at OWISTA Corporation. And I've been with the organization almost 5 years now, and I am zooming in from Traverse City, Michigan, where I live, and I am from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. And I'm gonna pass it off now to my colleague and friend, Crystal.
Hi, everyone. My name is Crystal Langholtz. I'm Chief Operating Officer for OWISTA. I am zooming in from the Front Range of Colorado near the beautiful Rocky Mountains. And I have been with OWISTA for 8 years. And before that was an executive director on the Crow Creek Reservation. So super excited. Thank you for joining us for this session today, and excited for a conversation. And I'm going to pass it over to Michaela.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Michaela, the lending assistant with OWISTA Corporation. I've worked for OWISTA for almost 2 years, and I'm joining in today also from Michigan, where I live. I am Anishinaabe from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians in the Upper Peninsula, and I'm super excited to be here today, and I hope everyone takes away something new and helpful from this session. And we do have a quick question. Where are you joining from, and how many external, actually, I don't believe that's one of my questions. I'm so sorry. Go ahead and follow that link in the chat and for our first Menti activity. And I'm gonna share my screen. And we just wanna get a little understanding of your knowledge of liquidity and asset liability management. All right, let me know if you have trouble in the chat getting to that link. A couple more seconds for people to put in their level of knowledge of liquidity. Perfect. And then I'm going to go on to the next question. It'll go. There we go. All right. So does your organization have a liquidity policy? And you can just go ahead and type in, okay, so we got a no. Lots of no's, which is good, and not yet. Awesome. All right. And then our next question, what is your knowledge level of asset liability management? All right. Looks like we do have some beginners and intermediate levels of knowledge. And then we'll go on to the next question. And then, does your organization have an asset liability management policy? Ooh, still in progress. Well, you know, the good thing is that you do have some beginner or intermediate knowledge, but and you can use that and hopefully from this course help your organization make these policies going forward. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And that was our first Menti activity. Thank you everybody for participating.
All right, that was super helpful to get a sense of where everyone is coming from and what everyone's experience level in this. And I think, you know, Flo opened up her comments, you know, she said that this is sort of a neglected area for a lot of our CDFIs. And it's certainly something that we've been thinking about more here at OISTA lately. So it's fun to get to connect with you all about this and share things that we've been learning, as well as to get to kind of share some best practices out in the field. But first and foremost, you know, we're going to try to adapt to sort of everybody. It sounds like we have some beginners, we have some intermediate folks. So we're all kind of in the same boat here. So we're going to spend some time doing some level setting as well, just around what is liquidity, what is asset liability management, why do they matter? And so what is liquidity? Liquidity measures the extent to which an organization has cash or access to cash that can be quickly converted to cash to meet those immediate or short-term obligations, right? So, you know, in a household finances, right, it's the ability of the family to be able to pay the bills if there's an emergency that happens. You know, it's that ability to have quick access to cash. And it's not as simple as it first appears. How much cash or what assets are liquid. It's not enough to understand a CDFI's liquidity position or liquidity requirements, as a CDFI needs liquidity to both manage operations and pay capital requirements. So that capital requirements being to pay back investors, right? So investors in CDFIs and other users of CDFI financial statements typically require a comprehensive understanding of what assets are available to pay for operating expenses, as well as what assets are available to make loans and repay investor obligations. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of those pieces today.
Next slide, please, Isaiah. Thank you. So I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about liquid assets. So liquid assets are assets that can be quickly converted to cash to meet immediate or short-term cash flow obligations that you might have. And really, when we're talking about liquid assets, we're talking about three different types. We're talking about cash, and that basically consists of anything that would be in your checking accounts and your savings accounts. The next thing on this list would be cash equivalents. And cash equivalents are typically investments that have short-term maturities of less than 90 days. And they're considered liquid assets because they can be readily converted to cash to be used for any type of cash needs that arise in your organizations. Some examples of cash equivalents are CDs, US Treasury bonds, and money market funds, things like that. The next thing on the list is marketable securities. And marketable securities can either be a debt or equity instrument and listed on a tradable exchange, and again, easily converted to cash or exchanged. Some examples of marketable securities are stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. So stocks would be an example of an equity instrument, and the bonds would be an example of a debt instrument. So those are really the types of things that you might have on your balance sheet that go into liquid assets and help you calculate your liquidity. The next thing is we have a little, Michaela's going to take us into a mural activity. So Isaiah, if you could advance the slide, please.
The link is posted in the chat, and once everybody joins in, I will kind of explain how it works. So We're looking for some examples of cash, cash equivalents, and marketable securities at your organization. So just double click in a square to begin inputting your examples.
So what we're looking for here is things that you actually have at your organization and that appear on your balance sheet that you can use for liquidity in your org.
And again, just double click in the square to start typing your answer or your examples.
I love the names of these. Visiting sea lion, sea turtles. So fun and colorful. Oh, bummer. It sounds like it doesn't work on the iPad. Thanks for trying though, Amber. We're missing our visiting bear or whatever you would have been assigned to be. Bummer.
So I'm just kind of curious. I'm going to ask a couple of questions here. On the person who entered petty cash under their cash, could you unmute yourself and just share how much petty cash do you keep on hand and what types of things you use petty cash for?
Hey, that one was me, this guy. We don't have petty cash here at Occupy, but I know other CDFIs do, so I put it in there.
Okay, all right. Is there anybody else on here that has a petty cash?
We have petty cash at First Nations. This is Carly. We just use it for taking when someone comes in and makes a cash payment, just for giving them change. So we just have like 200 on hand.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you for participating in this activity. We're going to go on to the next session here. And Isaiah, could you please advance to slide number 7 on the PowerPoint presentation? So far in our discussion, we have focused on assets that we consider liquid. So assets that we consider easily converted to cash. But what we haven't talked about is any kind of restrictions or limitations that might be on those assets. So some examples I have here are anytime you have, a nonprofit organization and you're in receipt of grant funds, some of the cash you have is unrestricted and can be used for anything, and anything in your operations. You also would have some cash that were for grant and contract deliverables. You would also have cash for lending, and you might have investments. You might have a cash on loss reserve. You might have different things like that. So some of this cash would be restricted and therefore not used in your liquidity ratios. So I have kind of a sample listed out here. And this is really just basically the asset portion of a balance sheet or a statement of financial position. And it's a comparison. It shows you from March 21 to March 20, from March 21 to March 20, and the change in that. So if you look here, the unrestricted cash is the 3.7 million in March of 2021, and then March of 2020 it was 1.9. So there was an increase there in your cash for operations of about 1.7 million. And then as you can see, the rest of the cash that we would consider liquid here, it's still cash and it is liquid. However, it is restricted for what it can be used for. So as you can see, 2.6 million of the cash that's in their checking accounts, this is for grant and contract deliverables. So this means that it's grant money that has not been expended yet. And that's what that cash would be used for. And then cash for lending, of course, that can only be used for lending capital and to make loans. So I did want to point out that when you're looking at your liquidity, you'll always want to be conscious of what's available, like it's totally unrestricted cash, and then what your cash amounts are in each of your various like kind of little buckets. And if you can, it's great to break these out on your balance sheet because this really gives a truer picture of your liquidity and of your cash position to investors and grantors and anybody else that's kind of reading your financial statements. So I wanted to point that out and make sure that everybody understood that even though you have those accounts, there's a little bit in each one of those accounts that's for some of these other activities. And next slide, please, Isaiah. So why is this important? Liquid assets are really important for CDFIs. And it helps, accomplish a bunch of different things. Mostly it's to satisfy demand for loans. So you always want to make sure that you have the lending capital and the cash available for lending to make loans from your applicants that are coming in the door. And you also want to be able to pay all of your organizational expenses like rent, utilities, salaries, supplies, anything like that. And then of course you want to be able to pay back your investors as the principal matures. So you want to make sure that you have cash for all three of those things. So it's really important to watch this and monitor this so that you can see. So if you can refer back to the previous slide, you saw that there was lending capital, so cash available for lending. You have $8 million there, so you have plenty of cash available to meet that demand. And then your organizational expenses would come out of the top line on that balance sheet, and that was for cash for operations. And then of course the pay debt principal back, that would also come out of your cash available for lending. So it's really important to monitor that and to like separate it and to be aware of it. I don't see many balance sheets that have that segregation and that separation. I know some people keep track of that on spreadsheets and different other different mechanisms. However, it really is helpful to those readers or those people who are looking at your financial statements to have that broken out. And if you aren't tracking any of that right now, that it's really good. This would be a good start after this session or after this convening this week to go ahead and start, kind of tracking those things and keeping, having a separate ledger for them and actually knowing exactly where you stand.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add, we help a lot of native CDFIs apply for FA, and this is something you have to put on your FA application, these sort of allocations. And every year we end up with a bunch of folks calling us, sort of scrambling to help us figure this out on their financial statements. And so, if you could come up with a system now or get it on your balance sheet now, it'll save you the headache later on, right? Of trying to scramble and figure it out for your various kinds of applications where you need this information.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. And next slide, please, Isaiah. So we're going to talk now a little bit about actually managing your liquidity. So liquidity management involves analysis and monitoring of the size and the timing of cash inflows and outflows to your organization. So some of the information that's going to be required in order for you to be able to manage this is you're going to need to know the actual amounts of liabilities and when those liabilities are due. So what their due dates are. You're also going to want to know or have a history of your loan fund inflows and outflows. So you're going to want to have kind of a cash flow that's just for your lending. And it would be great if you had a couple of years that you could compare so that you could kind of get a trend going. So you would know, like, oh, in the first quarter, I'm probably going to have 100,000 in loans. By the second quarter, I'm going to have $500,000. By the third quarter, I need $1 million, or whatever those numbers are going to be. But as you start tracking that on an annually and quarterly basis, you'll start to see trends. You can put them in a spreadsheet and then graph them out, and you'll start to see those trends, and that will help you, measure that and get a kind of a handle on it. You also want a history of overall cash demands for all all outflows. So rent, utilities, supplies, salaries, all those things, you'll want to trend those out. You will also want a well-defined policy with established procedures for measuring, monitoring, and managing your liquidity. So appropriate liquidity management is about achieving the balance between risk and reward. So some potential repercussions of poor liquidity risk management can include temporarily delaying loan disbursements. So you don't want a client that applied for a loan and then have to delay them because you don't have the cash. Not making payroll, which would be very bad. Defaulting on investor payments, again, another bad thing. So any of these things, if this were to happen, it could result in serious damage to your organization's credibility and the ability to function normally. Whereas the benefits of a well-managed liquidity, it can include maximize income earned on all available assets and solid operating capital cushions. And given that CDFIs liquidity varies from day to day, keeping the appropriate balance requires proactive and consistent liquidity management. The differences between CDFIs require that each CDFI should establish and define its own individual liquidity policy, practices, and benchmarks tailored to its organization's product mix, financial situation, and long-term growth strategy. So it's okay to kind of share liquidity policies so that people can kind of get ideas what other people are doing. But it's always a good idea that you know your own information and you use your own information to develop your liquidity management policies, because all organizations are different. And this is one of those policies that can't really be duplicated from one organization to the next. And the next slide, please, Isaiah. So this slide kind of explains a little bit about a liquidity management policy and some of the things that are required. And I just kind of hit the highlights here. You can put a whole lot of information in these policies. But this policy, it should be revised and reviewed as needed and at least annually. So it's kind of like your financial management policies and your loan policies. You always want to make sure that you're looking at it and reviewing it and changing it if necessary. The policy should be flexible and enable your management to react quickly to any unforeseen events. So at a minimum, I would recommend that your policy include who's responsible for the liquidity management. What is your organization's general methodology behind it? What minimums and maximums do you want to establish for, like, what's the minimum that you want in your cash available for operations? What's your minimum that you want in your cash available for lending, and so on and so forth. You also want to establish ratio targets, and then you want to establish which assets you consider liquid, and then what's your overall cash minimum cash requirement to meet all of your operations for the year. So there is a ratio that we calculate, and it's how many months operating liquidity you have. And so and a lot of funders and grantors, and I know the CDFI fund especially, looks at that to see how much cash you have on hand to meet your operational goals. Okay, next slide, Isaiah. So this is just an example I wanted to discuss. So in this example, Ponderosa CDFI is 98% deployed, and they have a loan pipeline of about 1.2 million. So that means they have, clients wanting about $1 to $2 million. They don't have a current investment pipeline, and Ponderosa CDFI has no available lending capital to lend out and no prospects for additional lending capital anytime soon. If I want to just pose a couple questions to the group, and you can either put it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and speak out. But what happened with the CDFI and what should they do? Don't be shy. I'm trying to see who's on the session here so I can pick on somebody. Fern, how about you?
I'm still reading it.
I like Nikki's comment in the chat. She's gonna hit the pavement.
I would say do a loan application for OWISTA's loan capital pool.
Good answer, Fern.
Although there's no prospects.
So basically in this scenario, in this example, this CDFI just failed to plan their liquidity. So it's clearly obvious that they didn't have a liquidity policy and they left themselves really short on lending capital. So it's one of those scenarios we talked about in a previous slide where they're not able to make any loans because they don't have the lending capital. They just failed to manage their liquidity, and they got themselves, you know, in a kind of a jam here with having nothing to lend out. And we never, as CDFIs and as loan funds, we never want to be in this space. Next slide, please, Isaiah. So I'm just going to talk about some of the liquidity ratios we use to manage liquidity. And I'm going to put you on pause for just 1 second because we have somebody at the door and my dogs are barking. Okay, I'm back and I apologize for that. For CDFI liquidity ratios, there's a couple of them that we use. One of the ones we use is unrestricted cash and cash equivalents. And this calculates your operating liquidity ratio. So you take your unrestricted cash and cash equivalents. So that's kind of what we talked about earlier, how you have cash, but some of them are not unrestricted. Some of them are for specific purposes. So it's unrestricted cash and cash equivalents and plus your cash and cash equivalents restricted for operations. And you divide that by your total expenses for the prior fiscal year minus your non-cash expenses. So non-cash expenses would be things like depreciation, amortization, and that kind of thing that doesn't really it's on your financial statements, but it doesn't affect your cash. You multiply that by 12, and that's your operating liquidity ratio. For the minimum prudent standards for our native CDFI industry is you always want to have greater than 3 months operating liquidity ratio. And the other thing we use is a current ratio. And to calculate current ratio, you take your current assets and you divide that by your current liabilities. The minimum prudent standard we're looking for here is greater than 1.2. And then we have 2 more, your quick ratio, which is your liquid assets plus your current loans receivable divided by your current liabilities. We're looking for a ratio there of greater than 1.0. And then the last ratio is your capital liquidity ratio. So you take your liquid assets plus a specific percentage of current loans receivable, and that you would get off of your liquidity policy of what that was. And you would divide that by your current investor notes payable. And again, we're looking for a ratio here of 1.0. So to kind of explain these a little bit further, your operating liquidity ratio represents your months of operating cash that you have available. So we talked about that in a previous slide, but you always want to make sure that you have at least more than 3 months. And we really strive for like 24 to 36 months operating liquidity ratio. The current ratio, it's not considered the best measurement, because it could include assets that are not liquid, but we still use it, and some investors and grantors want to know that. The quick ratio is more of a traditional measure of liquidity, using only the most liquid of our current assets. And then the capital liquidity ratio really captures short-term investor debt that can possibly be repaid with available liquid capital. So I know we have some questions that I'll come back to, but I want to just kind of explain a little bit more on these ratios because they're super important, and a lot of people look at them, and it's really important as practitioners to actually know what these are. So on the operating liquidity ratio, the CDFI industry traditionally uses this ratio to objectively measure sufficiency in operating liquidity. So while there are a number of small variances in this definition, the above definition is the most frequently used. So that's how many months liquidity that we have for operations. When you're talking about this measurement, the measurement of months of operating cash or months of coverage can be viewed as a contingency funding in case of a crisis, like what just happened to us with the pandemic. Excluding unique circumstances, CDFIs should always have like that minimum of the 3 months, but again, really strive for that 24 to 36 months. So many CDFIs establish a policy regarding your minimum amount, and that should be included in that policy that we talked about. So you want to make sure you have a benchmark for that and really understand what your total cash outflows are. You also want to be conscious of inconsistent revenues. So if you had a really great year, 1 year, and you had a lot of grant money come in, your operating liquidity might be really high. But then if the next year you don't get all of those same grants, you might, find yourself where that liquidity ratio is really dropping off. So you want to make sure that whatever you're using to calculate that you're using consistent revenues. You also want to keep in mind available lines of credit that you might have, and then external factors, like a downturn in the economy or another pandemic, or an increased credit risk to the organization, or maybe you have increased risks in your portfolio credit, just different things to keep in mind like that. So Nikki asked, could I explain what it means to be a 1.2 or a 1.0? So basically that's just a ratio. So it's 1 to 2. So for example, if you want to make sure that your current assets divided by your current liabilities, that you can at least cover that once, and they're actually recommending it to be able to cover it 1.2 times as a minimum prudent standard. So that's kind of what that means. So you want to make sure that your current assets that you have will at least cover your current liabilities 1.2 times. So for example, if you had current assets of $1,000 and you had current liabilities of $1,500, that's a little bit lopsided. So in other words, for this current ratio to work properly, you would want to have 1,500 in assets and only 1,000 in current liabilities. And then Diana asked a question if these slides would be available, and yes, we will absolutely have them available. And I see that Crystal answered that in the chat already. So I thank you for that, Crystal. And then I'm going to, is there any questions right now, other questions on these liquidity ratios? Okay, and we're gonna move on to the next slide, and Crystal is going to explain a little bit about cash flow and how that plays into this liquidity.
Yeah. Before we transition to talking about cash flow and asset liability management, is there any questions generally about liquidity before we jump into those? Okay. All right. Just wanted to pause. And of course, we're going to have lots of time for questions throughout too. So, and I love how you're not being shy in the chat too. So that's good. So you'll see here the importance, we talk about the importance of monitoring cash flow. And specifically here, we talk a little bit about how you develop cash flow projections. You want them to be detailed and realistic. They capture all the different sources and uses for liquidity. They need to be updated and reviewed on a regular basis. The frequency can depend a lot about the CDFI's respective cash flow activities, but so it can depend a little bit about how much you've got going on, but definitely reviewed regularly. And it needs to be, I think this is really critical. It needs to be developed from information gathered from all of the departments, right? Because it's about the whole organization. So, you have with lending, you need to have information on rejected loan repayment. So I love Diana said that in one of hers when she was, what should that organization do? She's like, well, we need to check what our fees are going to be, right? What's coming back into the pipeline, right? That's part of cash flow. So I thought that was a really intuitive comment. We also, looking at renewed loans and committed loans that you're projected to have over the course of the period that you're analyzing. Funding, so looking at the projected outflows, so those that you're going to be paying back of your investors, and then also looking, those funding lines of credit that you have available. Development, right? On the development fronts, connecting with those to monitor if you have any new donations, grants, or other kind of funding money coming back in. When are you expecting, for example, to have your CDFI fund money come in, and when will that be available to you? It's part of those broader pictures around development and the flow of your cash. Accounting and finance, looking at your payables that you have going out. So if you have sort of regular annual big cash expenditures, knowing what quarter they're in can be very useful to you. Or expenditures for a building, new IT equipment, lots of other of those kinds of big expenses need to be planned and budgeted for. And then also, on the program commitment side, so for example, at OWISTA, whenever we do our capital access convening, we always know that we're going to need more cash that quarter, right? Because we're going to be paying for those facilities and doing all that, and have our scholarships go out to our partners, right? So knowing when those events are and sort of the operating cycle of your organization. And then also those cash flow projections need to be back tested on a regular basis to make sure that those assumptions were correct, right? So maybe you had thought that you were going to have a bunch of renewals from your investors and sort of had projected it that way, but found out, oh, no, that's not happening. Our investors are not renewing our notes like we planned. So you kind of need to always be comparing your assumptions about what that cash flow is going to look like to what is actually happening with your organization. And you really need to do that as accurately as possible. And it helps you understand those short-term financing needs, as well as, more importantly, those long-term strategic business planning. So helping you monitor and manage your liquidity, both operating and capital. And I will say that, we do this in a variety of different ways. At OWISTA, we do a series of very in-depth projections, of course, for our NACA. We also, Flo is a master cash flow planner and has a lot of different tools that she's developed over time to monitor this. So you can have a lot of different ways that this is in the life cycle of your organization. So next slide, please. Okay, asset liability management. So simply stated, asset liability management is just another form of planning. It allows managers to be proactive and anticipate change rather than reactive to unanticipated changes. Liquidity is also affected by asset liability management decisions, right? So that's why we did this session all at once and together. And it's very common, we talked about the liquidity policies, and we're going to talk about what's an asset liability management policies. You oftentimes will see those on the same document because they're so interrelated. But specifically, liquidity is affected by asset liability management decisions, and that any changes in the maturity structure of asset and liabilities can change cash flow requirements and flows. Your specific programmatic efforts to better serve clients can change the asset liability management and could have detrimental effects on liquidity if not monitored closely. So an example of that would be if you do a new program and you mark down your loan capital and you're like, woo, we're getting out on the streets, we're getting out on the streets, and everything picks up. You might go to find that, you do not have enough cash to do all that pipeline, right? So they're intimately related. Changes in interest rate also impact liquidity. We're going to talk about that a little bit more about interest rate risk, but if loan rates are lowered, clients might borrow more funds and then cause a liquidity shortfall. So higher interest rates on loans can make it difficult for some clients to meet their interest payments. And the CDFI's liquidity is directly related to asset liability management decisions. So management must always analyze the impact of any asset liability managed decisions on the liquidity position of an organization. And just sort of in short, asset liability management is the process of planning, organizing, and controlling those assets and liabilities, and really trying to do that to maximize your interest rate, to minimize your interest rate risk and maintain profitability. If you go to the next slide, Isaiah, it gives you the objective of asset liability management, which really encapsulated here. But, really at its core, what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the spread on your portfolio. So it is generating the most earned revenue for you and helping you reduce cash flow and interest rate risk. So we're going to go to the next slide, and we also have another fun example to talk about. And so I'm going to just read this and we can think about it together. But a housing-focused CDFI wants to provide a 30-year mortgage product for approximately 4% interest. It has a blend of equity and investor capital. Most of its loan fund currently has access to its investor capital for a term of 5 to 7 years, and then it also has that equity in its portfolio. So if you're the management of the CDFI and you're deciding whether or not you can do a 30-year mortgage product, what are the things that you should be looking at to evaluate whether or not that's an appropriate risk? So you can light up the chat, or you can take yourself off of mute to share. Any thoughts? What are your immediate questions on this one? Do you have any staggered investments or incoming loans? Great, right. So that's a great question to ask here, right? So right now they have terms of 5 to 7 years in their investor pool, but do they have any incoming investments that might allow them to feel comfortable stretching the terms of those longer? Great. Or ability track record to get them. Great. What other kinds of questions do you have? What else would this organization want to think through? So one of the things I immediately think through is how often does this capital renew, right? So we have this 5 to 7 year investor capital. I've seen some native CDFIs that have a 30-year mortgage and have investor capital like this. And that only works, right, if the investor is regularly renewing that investment. They're continuing to roll it over. So I would ask, well, what are the renewal rates of those investors? Ooh, we've got some good ones coming in. Okay. Nikki says cost of capital. Yeah, good question, right? So we have this very affordably priced mortgage product. Sounds great. We all want to get low cost capital out on the streets, but what is their current investor capital sitting at? What is their blended cost of capital coming in at? If it's coming at 4.5, that is not a great decision for them, right? But if, for example, is coming in at 1.8%, well, then maybe that works. Great, great. Do you have risk ratings on your current loans, and what does those look like? That's important too, right? Exactly. So thinking through with that 30-year mortgage product, at longer term loans, more risk. So thinking through, you know, how healthy is your portfolio now if you're going to take on a long-term product like that. These are great. I'm going through these. Okay. The only other one that I would say that we didn't capture would be how much equity does that CDFI have, right? So this is part of what sets that interest rate through the blended cost of capital, but it also, if you're looking at only a 5 to 7 year loan, well, that can potentially work if, you know, 95% of what's in your loan fund is equity, right? You might have the cash flow ability to match that perfectly well. But if that isn't, if you don't have very much equity, if it's really all largely that investor debt, when you do that cash flow planning, ooh, it's going to look really ugly. You're going to be heading towards a cliff after that 5 to 7 year mark, right? So great. I feel like we've really got that.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more to this, another thing you would want to be aware of is what the amortization on that investor capital was. If it was just a balloon payment at the end, or if it was monthly principal payments or quarterly principal payments. That's another thing you would want to also take a look at here.
Awesome. Totally. Thank you, Flo. Great. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about interest rate risk. So interest rate risk is the risk that changes may occur when the current market interest rates and how fluctuate and how they adversely impact the organization's financial performance. So, you know, if you have a lot of fixed rate interest in your portfolio, like this may not be as huge of an issue for you, but it's still something that's really important to understand and monitor, because interest rate risk increases when longer term fixed rate loans and investments are funded with investments that are shorter term, right? And those investments are replaced when interest rates will be repriced. So an example of that in the case of our Sweet Housing CDFI, so maybe they do have those rolling investments, right? Yeah, like our investors just stay with us forever. We love it so much. And they go and they make that 30-year loan at 4%, right? Sounds great. Nothing could go wrong. Well, what if when they go to re-up their terms, they increase their interest rate? And now that spread is maybe flipped. So now they've exposed themselves to further interest rate risk. Also, in an environment or high of unpredictable inflation also increases. And if assets and liability have high sensitivity to interest rate changes or in a competitive market. I think it really sits with us well. This makes, one of the reasons Flo and I tried to use a lot of examples is it all makes so much sense when you put it in the context of an example of a CDFI, right? So Isaiah, could you go to the next slide? We're gonna look at an example. And this is an example that hits close to home. Due to the pandemic, many CDFIs were forced to adjust interest rates and give other concessions on loans receivables to avoid large portfolio delinquencies and write-offs. But many investments remain concentrated in the fixed rate environment, right? And this scenario can cause financial performance to become impaired because CDFIs cannot adjust earned interest income upward fast enough as the cost of funds increases and remain the same. Did any CDFIs have this happen to them? Well, we at OWISTA, so an example of this for us was when we, in the pandemic, we put our entire portfolio on interest forgiveness. We said, we're not going to collect any interest in our portfolio for a full 9 months. Well, but we still had to pay back our investors, right? And so, that's kind of a unique example in that kind of unique situation. And it's one that we chose very comfortably. But we in that environment went back and asked for our investors to match our terms. But it's still an example that many of our CDFIs in the broader sense saw with COVID-19. So in this scenario, the interest expense on the investments is costing more, of course, than the earned revenue on the interest from the loans receivable. And it's important to note that some degree of interest rate risk is pretty much unavoidable, right? And we CDFI lenders, what we do is has inherent risk in it. We just accept that, right? We make a loan, some of our loans won't be paid back. We operate sometimes in environments that federal environments where we don't know if they're going to keep the funding up for the CDFI fund. There's inherent risk in all areas of our business model as CDFIs, and this is just like that, right? For us, it's not about saying we don't want any risk. It's about trying to monitor and manage it and mitigate it as much as we can, right? And do it and make decisions with our eyes open. For CDFIs, interest rate risk can be managed by matching the maturities and interest rates of loans receivables and the maturities and interest rates of investments, right? So the more closely aligned your receivables are and your investments, the easier this is. And the less risk you have. It's when you, for example, are willing to have a longer term loan and maybe have shorter term investments and doing that in a calculated way. It's in these other areas where you say, oh, it does, what really matters to us right now is getting the money out in the street. We understand that, this cost of capital isn't great, but we're going to do it anyway. It's those areas where you start to see that areas of potential risk that become more difficult to manage emerge. So with that, we are going to do a breakout room activity, and we have a good crew on this session. Woo! I love that. Wednesday afternoon, you were like, asset liability management, sign me up. But Isaiah, can you put us in rooms of potentially 5 for our breakout session? And I am going to put some questions in the chat for you all to introduce yourselves and have the opportunity to talk a little bit about what you're doing in asset liability management and have some peer-to-peer sharing. So let me put that in the chat, your questions, so they'll travel with you to your breakout rooms. And you will have, let's look at the time. Oh my goodness, Flo, we're good. We're going to give them a little bit of time here.
We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes or so in your breakout rooms. And we do want to really spend quite a bit of time discussing this when you all come back to the main room here. So, we're looking forward to your feedback on this and to really get some good ideas to share.
Great. So Isaiah, are we ready to head out to our breakout rooms? All right. So we're going to do just a little debrief. Are we all back? Let's see. Okay. Awesome. Looks like we're mostly back here. Welcome back to the main room, the main event, so to speak. So welcome. From my group, Joytika, is that, did I get it that time? Was I close? No.
That's perfect.
But I know you had volunteered to be our sort of spokesperson and report out just sort of where our group was at. Would you just jump in there and share a little bit about our conversation?
Absolutely. So we had a great group of Tanya, Fern, Andrew, and Crystal and Henrietta. And we sort of introduced ourselves and got to know each other a bit better. And we realized we were on the same boat, that we were just starting off on our journeys to develop the liquidity and asset management policy here. And we were like navigating through those questions.
Awesome. thanks. Yeah, we, our group didn't, because someone nobody in our group really had debt. There was not a lot to sort of manage on the asset liability fronts. And so there was a lot of, there was some good, I think we were planning ahead in our group as far as what that would look like. So with our next breakout room, Flo, what breakout room were you in? And then who's your spokesperson?
So I was in group 3, and Skaya and Joyce are our spokespersons, but Skaya's on the phone, or maybe she just hung up. So it's interesting because both of them come from totally separate organizations, like totally different organizations. So I'd like them to kind of share because they're very unique. Joyce just deals with pretty much right now long-term 30-year loans, and Skaya deals with an annual, long-term agriculture loans and only gets paid once a year. So the cash flow is much different, and there's different monitoring and different procedures that they both follow. So I'm going to have each of them share. So Skaya, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just shared that like with managing like our ratios and our assets and things like that. So when we deploy capital, we deploy it long time often, and it's hard to get investments that match that. So when we're trying to balance all that, we just want to make sure that the interest earned off of like our grant loan capital is enough to supplement the difference between what we're earning on that investment versus what we have to pay on that. So that's like another thing that we consider. And then we also talked about like operating reserves and like loan loss reserves. And currently right now we just have an accrual loan loss reserve, but we talked a little bit about like the pros and cons of having a cash loan loss reserve and then the operating reserve, and investing those operating reserves to be able to earn some interest on that, like in CDs or investment accounts or just different things like that, to also get yourself some unrestricted income and different things like that.
Our CDFI has been our loan department of the Housing Authority for a number of years, and so we have a small portfolio, but we recently became certified as a CDFI. So we're just in the hunt for capital, and most of our, like Flo said, most of our current loans are all 30-year loans, and we've just recently started to do shorter term repair loans for our folks. And so we do have a lending capital schedule that we manage. We don't have a liquidity policy, but it's on our list of things to do. But we do keep an eye on our capital. And here we're in Juneau, Alaska, and here the loans that we issue to folks for their homes are between like $350 and $450. So it eats through our capital pretty quickly. So we've been applying for capital, trying to get some more money in so that we can lend things out. And we did have a good discussion about investing our reserves to get some earned income. And I had said in our group that we had talked about that in another training. I'm sure it was an OWISA training I attended, and I had made a note then, and that was a few months ago. And so I made the note again, and I keep making that note, we'll actually accomplish it. So every time I make the note, it bumps up in my to-do list. So we really need to do that. And that's probably one of my takeaways from our session is to work on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joyce. And yeah, that's okay. We all function on CDFI time, which is the time that, when we have 8,000 clients calling us, which happened in our call, in our conversation. We had several people that got clients in their office. So totally get it. But that's awesome. I'm glad that was a helpful thought for you all. We're missing a group or two. Tani, what group were you in? And who was your reporter? She's like, where's my unmute button? Why does Crystal always call on me?
Is this me, Tawny?
Yes.
Oh, sorry guys, I froze, and I probably was all awkward when I froze. Anyway, I'm back. Yes, of course, I'm the spokesmodel. No.
I know you would be.
Spokesperson. Okay, so yeah, our group, we had an amazing group in our session. And so some challenges that orgs face regarding liquidity and asset liability management. One of our groups is a smaller CDFI, few funders, which are mostly federal. So more segregated capital, and then having lack of capacity to really get in there with all these opportunities that have been coming up. So not really a sophisticated system set up. I know that we are in build out phase right now as well. So really could relate to that. And then also what we do at Indian Fund is focus, the majority of our loans are going to be focused on large scale development projects for our tribal nations and economic development arms, with loans being anywhere from $1 to $5 million. So I appreciated what Skya said, and we kind of have that same situation where we don't have our capital that we have coming in isn't long enough to match up with some of our projects that may not generate revenue until year 5, year 6, if we're getting 7-year money. So that can be a challenge as well. Just jumping into question 2 really quick, which was, do we have limitations or restrictions on our assets? Heavily across the board, yes. A lot of grant specific activities. A lot of us don't have a lot of free capital. And of course, as we know, our lending capital is definitely restricted going into different loan pools. And so, yeah, we said we need a third category of slightly restricted pledge match cash. Ha, 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 ha. Yeah, full like that one. Yeah. And so are we doing a good job at managing these? Again, some of our shops are smaller, some are bigger. I know we are knee deep in the process of creating this. So I love timing, I believe is everything. You guys putting this session on, because this is something we're working on through the summer. So yeah, appreciate it. Check.
Awesome. And was that all of the groups, or did we have one more?
Group 4. Well,
Awesome.
we don't have an official reporter, but I did figure, Carly, Nikki, and Diana could all maybe say a little bit something if they wanted to with each question. But they definitely did have challenges in each of their different organizations. So whoever wants to go first.
I can start because I have to jump off in 3 minutes for a different meeting. And my sound is bad, so that's why I said, not it, because the sound is awful and I apologize. But talked about, right, challenges and being, right, separating, right, operating funds from funds earmarked for lending. So I know that could be a challenge others have too. Like, so we talked about solutions, like, would you want separate banking accounts for those? And then really getting to just time and capacity to be able to sit down and kind of do it yourself model versus outsourcing some of that asset liability management work. It's hard though, because we're often like wearing many hats, staff of 1 at times, staff of 2, or small shops. So that can be kind of hard and the challenge itself. And then Tani covered the challenges from Indian Fund pretty well, right? We do have a lot of debt, but we also have being able to stack it so it can be longer term would be ideal. We're finding longer term 0% money. That's what I've been working on. So asset restrictions, yes, people mentioned some of the others, but also loan loss reserves are restricted funds as well. So that was something we talked about. And then just having incoming investments that have different terms and different requirements too.
And just real quick, Nikki, you can manage your cash available for lending on your statement of financial position without having a separate bank account. So you can manage that separately so that you don't have to incur those fees and the bank reconciliations for a bunch of different accounts.
Well, that was something that my executive director, Becky, was curious about. We were wanting a way to separate between lending funds and operational, since it's just asked of us so much. So I guess, I was wanting to get more information on a better way to do that. So I mean, I kind of thought we didn't need a bank account. There was a better way to separate it. But yeah, so if you've got a good way of doing that, I know we kind of talked about it, but I probably would have to look at that recording again in the beginning.
Yeah, sure. Just reach out to us after the convening. And I can set up, you know, a TA call with you and show you how to do that. So.
Okay, that would be fantastic.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Well, that was
Diana, if you want to say a little bit as well. I know you had some challenges.
Hi, everybody. So some of the challenges that CTLF faces is, you know, trying to reach out to investors. You know, I feel like there's a lot that they don't fund or won't, or because we're so small and live in a rural area. Investors is, for me, is just trying to talk to them and trying to get the ask from them. I had talked about the separation of grants and, you know, what goes out for lending, what goes in for operations, and the breakdown. You know, our CPA does a wonderful job of breaking everything down. And we do have we do have a couple loans, one with OWISTA, one with Craft 3, and a very small one with Credit Builders Alliance. So those have been very, very helpful with our program. Some of the restrictive stuff that we currently have is with our loan loss reserves and a few of the grants that we have received. You know, just basically trying to get a breakdown. Our CPA has been phenomenal in assisting me with, you know, what we can spend and how much we have for lending. And I think one of my main worries is just trying to get the operational dollars just to keep the office moving, you know, on a daily basis. And with COVID and everything happening, we have people that are, you know, afraid to even come in and borrow because they don't know what their employment status is going to be. And, you know, I know that there's jobs out there, but you have people that are, I'm just gonna flat out say it, sitting on their, and, you know, don't want to go out and get a job per se. But then you have people that are looking for a job and can't get hired because of who knows what their reasoning is. I know there's a lot more that I want to say, but I just can't bring it out right now.
No worries, Diana. Thank you for sharing. We appreciate that. And we can certainly relate to some of those struggles that you're facing. And just be aware that, you know, OWISTA is here for you and can assist you. So be sure to reach out if you need our assistance with anything. And Isaiah, can you please go to slide 20 on the deck? So we are winding down here on our presentation. We have just a few minutes left, but I did want to talk about asset liability management monitoring and some of the tools that you could use for that. And basically there's three things that we look at. One is a sensitivity analysis. And basically this analysis reports on the range of possible financial outcomes that your organization could have. So it kind of tracks changes in a lending and funding portfolio, your financial projections and your related cash flow projections, all kind of in one little analysis. And you can change those dynamics and change those ratios that you're looking for. And you can choose to stress if you wanted certain asset durations or certain models in different scenarios so that you can see which would perform best for you. And then with a waterfall analysis, this sensitivity analysis modifies the organization's cash flows under various scenarios as well. But we use sample variations with a baseline cash flow projection. So we look at things like the behavior maturity analysis of our loans, both incoming and outgoing. We look at how those liabilities are performing, and we look for, like the maturity dates and how those are related to cash flow, and things like that. And then on the last one, the interest rate sensitivity analysis, the goal of this stress test is really to understand how changes in interest rates on both our loan portfolios and our investments impact our financial situation. So unlike banks and credit unions, the non-depository financial institutions like ours, the loan funds, we don't typically use all of those sophisticated risk management methodologies that the banks do. So we really have to look at interest rate and how that's affecting us with our loans receivable and our loan notes payable. And next slide, please, Isaiah. This talks just about, asset liability management policy. Again, as Crystal stated, it can be combined with your liquidity policy. But as in all operational areas, you should guide this part of your financial management with a formal policy. And as previously stated, the policy should be reviewed annually and revise it as needed. And you can combine the two policies into one or have them separate. It's totally okay. But in any case, the biggest thing to remember is your asset liability management policy and your liquidity policies cannot be written in isolation, because the decisions affect both things. So your decisions on lending, your decisions on investments, which investments to take, which liabilities to take, how is your equity interrelated? They all affect both your ALM policy and your liquidity policy. Next slide, please, Isaiah. So I just wanted to share real quick as we're closing out. I wanted to share some of the tools that I use. So what this chart is showing you, the red line indicates outgoing interest, and the blue line indicates incoming interest payments. So incoming interest payments to the org is the blue line, and red is outgoing to investors. So as you can see, this cash flow model looks really good. The only place we kind of have an issue here is out in 2026. We have a little bit of where our incoming is slightly lower than our outgoing. So that could pose an issue. But because it's 2026 and it's only 2021 right now, basically we have 5 years to plan for that and to do some different, pay off some higher rate investments and get some lower rate investments so that goes back to how it looks for 21 through 2025. And then your next slide, the next slide, please, Isaiah. So on this one, this shows a little different story. This is really not what you want your chart to look like, but this is a real chart. So this is payment principal, principal going in and going out. So again, the blue line indicates your incoming principal payments, so from your loan clients, and the red line indicates your outgoing principal payments. So as you can see, it's all over the board, and there hasn't been this hasn't been managed well. In some instances it has, where the blue is larger than the red. But again, there's a little bit of time. You have some time between like 22 and 23 to plan for 2024, where there's a big discrepancy. And again, in 25 and 26 to plan for 2027 when there's a larger discrepancy between the two. So again, that allows you to plan out your investments. This chart really shows you what you need to do. So you need to, pay off some investments prior to 2022 when you have less coming in, and vice versa for the other years. So this really helps with cash flow planning, and it really helps to tell you exactly what you need to do with both your principal and interest. Next slide. So this is just in summary real quick. It's important to note that liquidity and asset liability management are very closely tied. And so us, as native CDFIs and loan funds, we really have to effectively manage our liquidity so that we can ensure that we always have low-cost funds available to make loans when the demand arises, and then repayment to our principal investors, and of course, payment of our operational expenses. And so just real quick, because we are at time, I wanted to open it up for questions that any of you might have. No questions. Okay, well, I thank you so much for attending this session. And if you have any questions after the fact, please feel free to reach out to either Crystal or I.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.